I'm Sean Fennessey.
I'm Amanda Dobbins.
And this is 25 for 25, a big picture special conversation show about Spirited Away. We finally have an animated film on our list. Amanda, how are you feeling about that fact?
I feel great. Jack, our producer, was like, I don't know what the argument against Spirited Away would be. And that's not the point of this series that we're doing.
No arguments.
There are no arguments. What a beautiful film.
We've had some complicated conversations about animation on this show over the years, but
What does that
recently,
mean?
well, it means that Chris doesn't watch them, and you will watch them, but not with intensity.
Yeah, it's not my preferred format. What would we call it?
Style of
not
filmmaking?
even genre. Yeah, style of filmmaking. But I think it's pretty hard to argue with this as a visual masterpiece and as a way of telling a story that could only be told through animation.
That's, I think, the biggest reason why I'll spoil the fact that this is our only animated film on the list. And so
you've been getting a little nervous about spoilers in the last few.
Well, some things I want to share and some things I don't.
Okay.
So anybody who's earmarking a space for a film like WALL-E or a film like Up or The Incredibles,
they're out.
They're Coco out.
Never even on the short list or the long list.
I have a soft spot for Ratatouille, and I think there was a version of this list where I would have made a bid for it, but I would never have made it at the expense of a Hayao Miyazaki film. And Miyazaki's made a few movies in this century. If I had my druthers, I think My Neighbor Totoro and Princess Mononoke would be
your picks?
My all-time Miyazaki picks, but those are films that predate the 21st century.
Those are not eligible for this. I do think when we were putting the list together, my inclusion was any Miyazaki film that you want, but I assume it will be Spirited Away.
That is what you wrote, and that is where we landed.
And that was like the only animation slot that was available.
Miyazaki, one of them, maybe at the top of the inarguable leaderboard of filmmakers, along with like Spielberg and Coppola, and a very short list of filmmakers for whom the industry has kind of rallied around him over the last 40 or so years since he's been making films. Somebody who is widely acknowledged to have pushed the style of filmmaking forward, storytelling forward, but also somebody who's heavily indebted to the 100-plus year history of cinema and even the hundreds of years centuries history of storytelling. And I think he's kind of an interesting person in the aftermath of our classics conversation, Amanda Classics, because this movie is very indebted to the history of fairy tale. So Spirited Away is a film that came out in 2001, but not in America. In Japan, it came out in 2001 and very quickly became the highest grossing movie in the history of Japanese cinema. It only recently, I think in 2020, got knocked off by a Demon Slayer film, which I know you saw in theaters during COVID. This movie was an absolute phenomenon, which on the one hand, I think makes sense because it's arriving at that moment. You could probably compare it to sort of like the Jurassic Park moment in Steven Spielberg's career, where it's like he's done this 5 or 6 times in a row now. And there was a lot of anticipation for the film. The film's also hugely defined by its point of view on Japan at that time in history and its relationship to sort of like where it was in the 80s and 90s and what it was becoming in the 21st century. And it's also a movie that appeals widely to very young people all the way to very old people. It's a movie literally about life and death and everything in between those spaces. So this was a huge movie in Japan. And I think it's a fitting movie to add to our list because even though it is not the first film that was brought to America, Miyazaki film that was brought to America, is kind of the signature movie that was brought to America. John Lasseter, who was working at Pixar at the time, was a massive fan of Miyazaki, and a friend, Michael Eisner, encouraged him, hey, maybe we should distribute this movie. And they did. They brought it over to America and made a good amount of money, and it won the Best Animated Feature at the Academy Awards. And I think that not that win specifically, but that conversion makes it a nice, tidy entry into our list because I think without a movie like this, I'm not sure if we get to the place where Parasite wins Best Picture, for example. I see it as an interesting link in the chain of the globalization or internationalization of cinema in the United States. Because even though this movie was dubbed when it was released here, the storytelling style, the way that it looks, the names of the characters, this was an introduction to a lot of people at a very young age to Japanese storytelling.
I was going to say the other part of it is really the generational aspect because I do think like Miyazaki films became so huge to kids about 10 to 15 years younger than us.
Exactly.
Hi, Jack. Hi, Bobby.
Bobby
Hi,
Wagner,
everyone.
of course, yeah.
Who were experiencing them at a very particular age, and an age where many of the characters are that their age as well. But so it opens up not just animation to them, but also world cinema, and even a little bit like being a film bro. That
For
you're
sure.
like that you're going in like with the
culty quality
exactly.
of movies. Yeah, and I mean that persists. Miyazaki and the Studio Ghibli films, I think, exist in this unusual liminal space between Disney and film bro cult. Like there is an entire amusement park dedicated to the world of Studio Ghibli. There is all kinds of merchandise that you can buy. And yet these are still sort of boutique films, and they're not serialized in any way. They're inspired by stories, but they're not necessarily adaptations of stories. It's not Marvel or Aladdin and Aladdin 2 and then the live action Aladdin. There is something kind of, contained about the individual movie experiences of them. And yet there is a stylistic thing about Miyazaki's hand-drawn animation and even the animation of the other filmmakers who work at Ghibli that does feel like it is part of like an industrialized machine, even though it's humans that are making this work for the most part.
Right. But it's like, it is a house style that has become readily identifiable, and like, forgive me for bringing corporate terminology into this, but like a brand on its own. And there are people that like, they are heavy into the merchandising, speaking of the Disney of it all, but it is like boutique or like art house merchandising for whatever reason. It's a funny, especially given the topic of most of the films.
Yes.
That they're straddling those worlds just so.
Yeah. I mean, the why of this film on the list is pretty wide ranging. I do think that this happened after we determined that this movie would make the list, but the AI Studio Ghibli style that emerged just a few weeks ago, we're recording this in May of 2025, was a reminder of how these, like the co-optation, I think, of art into these like machine-like systems persists, is relevant, is obviously a little bit gross and dangerous. The idea of like the office of the president using the Studio Ghibli AI transmitter to create versions of the stories that he wants to tell is kind of unfortunate and probably would make Miyazaki want to kill himself, but is also kind of an inevitability of the power of the work that he was making, that it found its way across the world, across generations, all over the place. And I find that really fascinating because while I've always, enjoyed Miyazaki films since the first ones I saw, and I would imagine this is this is probably the first one that I saw. I probably saw this in college, but not in a movie theater. But since I've been watching these movies, I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all, but these are weird movies. I know that you were getting more acquainted with them when The Boy and the Heron came out, and Miyazaki had this kind of huge second wave in America and won another Oscar.
And then Porco Rosso came into my house.
And then Porco Rosso.
I live in the world, and that is a far less weird movie than this movie.
Yes.
Which is like fantastical. And I think it's okay that it's weird. It is supposed to be a strange and exciting fairy tale. And so all of the creatures and the things that the creatures do and the way that the main characters make their decisions or interact in the world is like supposed to be a little unusual. It has some like, Grimm's fairy tale, those things are weird too. Like the imaginary world does not always have to be this, Disney pink, like everything's happy things. Your imagination can get funky too.
It's true. I think the film is really firmly rooted in a handful of other Disney classics. Alice in Wonderland, of course, and Lewis Carroll's writing is obviously a huge influence on this movie. Pinocchio and the kind of transmogrification of children, the thin line between human and beast that movie really explores. Peter Pan, I think, is obviously also hugely important just in terms of kind of flying, the transporting to a Never Never Land kind of a space, and also the sort of creatures that can communicate in ways that you would never expect them to in the human world. The one thing that separates, I think, those movies from this one in particular is this is a movie that even if it is not explicitly about death, it is very much about the space between life and death, in the spirit world. And that is very heady. And as the parent of a toddler, we've had a couple of death conversations recently. And a movie like this kind of confronts you with some of those concepts because of the loss of parents early in the story.
Right.
And we should say that this is a story about a young 10-year-old girl named Chihiro who is moving with her parents to a new home in a new town. She's left her school. She's left her friends. They're on a car trip at the beginning of the movie. They pass by this sort of collection of stones that represent past lives. And they're headed off to their new house. And on their way, her father takes a shortcut and they go into this kind of backwoods area and they come upon an abandoned amusement park. But then strangely at the abandoned amusement park, there's food.
Right.
It seems like food that has recently been prepared. And her parents, as representatives of the metaphorical, greedy, westernized.
Her parents drive an Audi.
Yes, post-80s Japanese, gorge themselves and transform into pigs. And when they transform into pigs, this world becomes a new world. It transforms into the spirit world. And Chihiro goes on a magical adventure.
Right.
That is sometimes gross, sometimes scary, sometimes beautiful, sometimes profound. But
sometimes random.
It's odd. I mean, I think it's very, very, I think that's sort of what I'm getting at.
That the rules don't follow any sort of basic real life logic. And you're like, oh, so that's how this is? Oh, like, okay.
Yeah, and that's also true.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's also true in other Miyazaki movies, but this one in particular, I think, feels like a head trip. It feels like someone is having a dream. You know what I mean? Where there's blank spots in the dream. There's blank spots in the logic of how the world works. And the more times that you watch it, the more you can kind of see what the connective tissue is for each storyline and what each character represents. And it can be understood as a deeply metaphorical movie. But Miyazaki has said that this is a movie for 10-year-old girls. He wrote it for 10-year-old girls that he knew at a certain time in his life, that he was inspired by the manga books that those girls were reading, and that he wanted to kind of transport some of his interest in fairy tale to those girls. But Chihiro is not like a typical girl character, I would say. Like, what do you make of her as a figure in this story?
I just want to hug her the whole time because as the parent of toddlers, you immediately put yourself into this. But she is willful, but like she was a little less she was a little more scared and a little more uncertain than the like typical hardy like YA protagonist that like we've been sold for the last 15 years. Like she's vulnerable even at the same time as she is like really focused on getting her parents back and doing whatever task she needs to do and observing the world and making the connections and like, I guess sticking up for herself in the right moment. But there's a lot of like, I can't, and I don't know how to do that. And what am I supposed to do? And this sense that this really is a small kid who doesn't totally know how to function without her parents.
Yeah. She's kind of has some of the defiance and petulance that you'll find in a young girl. Like I really identify closely some of the stuff that she is doing, but also that sense of confusion and some frustration and being taken advantage of in certain experiences and basically like learning what it's like in the real world, even while it's happening inside of a fantasy world. One of the things that distinguishes the movie is Miyazaki's animation style is widely acclaimed, but this movie, maybe more than any other, is like the pinnacle of what he does in terms of like color, things that are happening. I wanted to talk to you about this specifically. You have identified athletic filmmaking as like potentially a bit of a crutch for certain filmmakers.
Right. They're
just
being
to say
too showy. Well, they're like, the camera's their toy. And they're more interested in like what they can do with their toy and like where the camera can zoom and go than actually using it to create an image or to further a story in like a meaningful way. Like the camera is the story.
Right. And animation is different in that respect. Obviously, the camera can move and does move in animated features, but in hand-drawn, he's more often focused on the frame, on the still space, and then everything that he can fit inside of it. So you can watch this movie a few times and see something different in every corner of every action. And this isn't essential to enjoying the movie, but when you think about the amount of work that goes into making a movie that feels that way, that is drawn by hand,
right?
This is like a huge achievement. Most animated movies that you watch in the computer generated era, it's a flat surface. It's almost
Right.
a 2D surface with characters moving inside of it. And this is one that feels like it is like background, foreground, life in every frame.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about it, it's obviously a huge like technical like application of skill,
Mhm.
achievement, but like whatever, it is absolutely beautiful. Like
Yeah.
that, it is just straight up art, like the color especially. And but you know, either the hand strokes or the brush strokes, the creatures, it is a feat of imagination, it is a feat of composition, it is a feat of just something that you want to look at.
Mhm.
And because an animator, I guess, has like even more control over the frame, I guess you could then term it as like athletic filmmaking because he's like really showing off. But like, I don't care if you can do this. It's not showing off. It's
Yeah.
just making something beautiful.
Yeah, I think it is also useful in terms of pushing the story forward because it's kind of showing us whether it's an like a literalization of the spirit world or
Yeah.
just a literalization of everything that is in Chihiro's head, where she can kind of like imagine
Right.
what would be in a space like this. That this is a true story. My daughter woke up this morning and she came out of her bedroom and she said, "Dad, I think I had a dream." And I said, what did you dream about? And she said, "I dreamed that you got me a present." I was like, I know this game. I know what she's doing here. And then I was like, well, what was the present?
Yeah.
And then she started describing something
Uh-huh.
that is not possible, not logical,
Okay.
not real.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it would be
yeah.
like, it was an alligator, but it was alive, but it was friendly, you know, like that
Right.
kind of thing. And the movie is like a representation of that. You know, you see these creatures, you see the little soot bugs, or you see the 8-armed man, or you
Right.
see all of the various like frogs and walrus people and all the various
Is
creatures.
it a turnip or a radish spirit
It's a good
that
question.
who hides her in the
I believe it's a
elevator?
turnip. I always get those confused as well.
He's whoever he is, he's or she. I
Yeah.
guess I shouldn't.
There's also a critical figure in this movie, which feels like the most childlike logic of all time. That is a dashing young man,
Mm-hmm.
but that is also a dragon,
Yeah.
but that is also a river spirit,
Yeah.
and the spirit of a river that has been damaged in some way.
Mm-hmm.
It's been toxified, and it doesn't realize it's a river spirit anymore because of what we have done to this planet.
Yeah.
It's a pretty tangled metaphor, but it also is weirdly representative of how it feels to be a kid. I think that's one of the things I like about the movie is that it's just unbound. It
Right.
feels like unstuck on a lot of the things that we come to expect when we're watching a movie. And we're like, why does this not connect to this? And why does that not connect to that? And in some ways, I think that can be frustrating for some viewers. But for the most part, I think if you turn yourself over to it, it can be very beautiful.
Yeah, but there's something, it doesn't insist upon its
Mhm.
own logic. Also, it gives into that fantastical quality. And there is something that is like much like a child, like the movie or Miyazaki, you know, whoever really believes that what you're seeing is the way that it is.
Mhm.
And this is just like, this is what's going on. And so you find yourself more willing just to kind of be like, I'm in this dream world and I'm going with it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. There's no smugness. There's no irony. No characters turn and look at the camera and wink. The other thing is that even though this film and all of his films are very influential on the Pixar storytelling style, this isn't a kids movie made for adults, and it isn't a kids movie made for kids. It's like a movie that Miyazaki made for himself.
Yeah.
That is somehow universally understood, which is, I think, actually the way that we tend to locate like our favorite auteurs, like our favorite filmmakers, the people that are important to us on the show are kind of like, this person made this because it mattered to their soul, not because they were like, I have to meet the expectations of what the Disney board wants in Q4.
Right. And we'll be able to sell this little widget guy.
Exactly.
Or also, this is what I think of 10-year-olds or 8-year-olds.
Yes,
and
exactly.
What makes them laugh versus what makes me feel something.
Mm-hmm.
And like you and I know that kids also actually, they know when they're being talked down to,
Mhm.
and they actually respond much more to just someone's like expression of what they want to say.
I don't know if brave is not the right word, but it's cool that Miyazaki is so committed. I mean, he's famously like a curmudgeon and sort of like very difficult and
Yeah.
very like, I have my idea and we're sticking to my
Well,
idea.
you can tell that too,
Yes.
right? Like it's singular.
Yeah.
It's just like you are in someone's very, very specific and playful and soulful and strange in a great way, specific brain.
Yeah.
And it can only if it were, you know, farmed out to a lot of different people, you would feel it. There is something about the like one person's journey of it that makes it work.
It's funny because pre The Boy and the Heron, he hadn't made a movie for a very long time. And during that time, I think his cult grew pretty significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And we, I think the episode we did around Boy and the Heron was Bobby, Andy, and Charles. And that's really like,
yes,
different age experiences, different life experiences, people from different parts of the country. And they all had really, really strong feelings about his films. But I think that we had forgotten a little bit like how dug in he is on his strong point of view until we saw The Boy and the Heron. Because a lot of people who saw it, it's a wonderful movie. It's not one of my favorites of his, but it's kind of aggressively him. He wasn't trying to satisfy his audience, or he hadn't like softened in his old age. He was like, I'm gonna make the teeth on this heron disgusting, and you're gonna be forced to look at it for 35 minutes. And this movie has the same thing where there's like a sludge monster and No Face is kind of vomiting up living creatures. Like there's something quite gnarly, quite gross about his vision of the child's mind or these fantastical worlds that he builds, which is great. Like I've now watched every Disney animated feature ever made with my daughter. It never really goes there.
Yeah,
it never really goes there.
We talk a lot about how, and now we just sound like two really old parents. So, put us on the glacier. But back in our day, you walked uphill both ways, and they did make kids entertainment that was like slightly gnarlier. It was never this. Well, sometimes it was this gnarly in its own way, not this particular favorite because only Miyazaki is Miyazaki. But again, the kids know when they are being condescended to, and it like flattens. Like the world is wild, and children need art to help them understand it as much as we do.
I totally agree. I find Lasseter to be an interesting character in this story in part because I never really feel as much Miyazaki, specifically in his movies.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Cars, I don't really feel Miyazaki. Maybe a little bit in terms of the kind of generation gaps, which is a big theme as well in Miyazaki movies. But if you look at some of the later Pixar movies, certainly some of the soulful stuff in Up, some of the soulful stuff in Ratatouille and WALL-E, but even more specifically in Soul and in Turning Red, those are the movies that are these like existential crisis films.
Right.
One about a 13-year-old girl, one about a much older guy. But they're explorations of something deep, and they're trying to use like basically a child's format to convey something really powerful. They're not quite on this level, but you know what I'm trying to say.
No, I do. I mean, I think, but they are a little bit stuck in that. Is this a movie for kids?
Right.
Is this a movie for adults? And some of that is just because in 2022 or whatever, you have to satisfy 18 different audiences and corporate boards. But they're definitely influenced by it. I mean, Domi Shi, the director of Turning Red, was like, this is my favorite film, or one of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah.
So, and that's another thing where, like we said, all of the kids, all of the young people who are into movies grew up on Spirited Away, and then all the rest of the Miyazaki films. So the influence of this movie is not just in like the other animated films, but in how all the young people watch movies.
It's very true. And that idea of the perfect movie is one that we haven't burked too much so far in our conversations. Came up during Children of Men.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably the last time we were like, God damn.
Yeah.
This is really tight. There's not a lot to quibble with.
Note.
There's favorite, and then there's a mastery, right?
Right.
And we've got a lot of favorites on this list, and we've got a lot of
Melancholy
masters.
Is perfect.
I'm not making any critical judgments in this conversation specifically about other films.
And I think Keanu Reeves in Something's Gotta Give is a well-developed and perfect character.
I'm not litigating anything with you, I promise. We stand together on this list. However, I'm interested in the idea of the perfect movie, of the way that people will identify something and say, this is magnificent, because I don't know, what is the imperfect version of Spirited Away? What's the version that fails? I think it's singular. And that's
Right.
probably like the more appropriate way to define the fawning admiration for it, is that there's just nothing like, Steven Spielberg very famously said, I think this is better than any Disney movie ever made. And that's high praise from somebody who understands what it's like to reach for a perfect movie. And I find that interesting that it has gotten to this place in this 25-year period. It may have gotten to this place more than almost any movie on our list. Can you think of another movie that's even coming that you think would be defined in that way?
Well, for us, yes, I can think of a couple
Set us
on
aside.
the list.
Think of the unknowable universal canon. I can think of a couple.
On our list.
Yeah. I can think of a couple that we purposefully excluded.
Well, sure.
That would be deemed as such.
That's fine. But once you're asking me to speak for the people, that becomes
dangerous, risky territory.
Complicated. I'm trying. I mean, it is so generational.
Yeah.
There are some movies that we think are perfect, and the younger kids are like, "What are you doing?"
Mm-hmm. Like The Princess Diaries.
Sure, it's a great film.
Sure.
Princess Diaries 2 is very early in Chris Pine's career. We wouldn't have him without it.
Haven't seen it.
So
how does it stack up to Spirited Away?
They do have to go to a fictional place and then learn its rules and regulations.
Okay. Or is everyone there dead?
Well, it's really dead
How many
on
of
the
them
outside, dead
pigs?
on the inside.
That's a good point. Yeah. No parents who've been turned into pigs in that film.
I actually don't know what happens to Anne Hathaway's parents. Well, I guess her mom's in the first one. I don't know whether she makes the trip to Genovia.
Okay.
I don't remember that. Her grandmother is Julie Andrews. Jack, am I right?
No idea.
Oh, come on.
Does Genovia border Sokovia in the Marvel Cinematic
probably.
Universe? Okay,
Yeah.
Good to know. This film, part of what is amusing to me about some of that like merchandising and the iconography of the movie is like what is becoming
also
iconography.
the memeing of this movie,
Yeah.
which is what rewatching it, I was like, oh, that still and that still and that still.
There's the famous Chihiro and No Face on the subway boat that's them sitting together. That's it. That's the one. I didn't even know that was the image. But that image of the sort of like me and my Knicks fandom, sitting together on the train, which is funny because this character is complex and mysterious and indebted to like 1960s horror spirits in Shinoda films. Like it's very unusual kind of figures for them to have been like subsumed into our internet life, but they very much have been. And to me, they're not the same. Like in My Neighbor Totoro, there's a lightheartedness to the imagery, to Cat Bus.
Right.
This movie is much more severe.
Yeah. Has Alice seen this one yet?
No, she's never.
Okay. Yeah.
I just feel like it's too
scary.
soon. Yeah. I think it's way too early. And I think it's instructive that Miyazaki says that I made it for 10-year-olds. And I'm sure if you were 7, 8, and 9, you could watch a movie like this, but it's not for toddlers. It's not Ponyo. It's not even Porco Rosso, which is like, hey, that pig is flying a plane. Like any kid can kind of like lock into that.
Well, and just also the planes.
Right. Yes. I mean, this does have rivercraft of a kind. It's got flying dragons. It does have things kids like.
Yeah.
But it has so many things that I think would be confusing to extremely young kids. But it'll be interesting, like revisiting all of the Miyazaki films with her. Like she did watch. What did she watch? Howl's Moving Castle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a little too soon for that.
Okay.
That's a fierce story about warriors. And Miyazaki also excels at those kinds of stories. Those are really there's 3 strands. There's like grouchy old men, like The Wind Rises. Porco Rosso is like there's some guy smoking a butt who needs to like get on a mission.
Lives in a beautiful, beautiful lagoon, though.
Absolutely. And then there's young girl or young boy who's been confronted by a traumatic experience and needs to find their way through a complex emotional world. And then the third one is like young guy with a sword who needs another young gal who needs to like climb a castle in the sky.
Right.
This one falls into that young childlike zone, but it is arguably the most adult of his movies, short of The Wind Rises. So it occupies a very unusual space.
I mean, it's a coming of age story in a lot of ways, as well as being a fantasy story. And so those are technically about younger people, but we consume them through all ages of life.
You never moved as a kid, right?
I moved houses, but not cities.
Okay. I never moved as a child, but I had certainly had friends who moved and kids who moved like into my life from other places. And you often hear of this movie that this is one of the most profound representations of the emotional turmoil of being torn out of your adolescence in one way and placed into another environment and being forced to look at what your future could be and just how disorienting it is and how upsetting it can feel. And there's something amazing about this. I mean, at the time he made this movie, I think he was in his late 50s. And for him to tap into that sensibility is very powerful.
He seems to maintain a childlike wonder.
He does. While also like smoking a lot of butts and being mad about everything.
You know, we all contain multitudes.
We do. What else? Anything else you'd like to share about Spirited Away?
I had forgotten that I basically have a big baby of my own now. Like
you sure do.
I mean, Sai and Bo are really
they got a lot in common.
Yeah, Sai's allowed to go outside though. But otherwise I was like, oh, I see what's happening here.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about Yubaba in this film or her twin sister?
Her twin sister seemed nice.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Zeniba? Yeah.
Yeah, Zeniba. What happened there between them?
Some sort of falling out. I think there's some Wicked Witch of the West, Wicked Witch of the East stuff going on there.
Okay, but it's not it's not really explained in a way that
No, that's the other thing is we're not too bound up in the lore.
Yeah.
You know, we don't need to understand too much about how this stuff works.
I don't know if we need that many rings on our fingers would be my styling note to her, but obviously it communicates a lot.
How do you feel about her as a representation of the kind of westernized grotesquerie of like fabrics and prints and all of these, the colorful style that is kind of in opposition to the, more historically staged Japanese style?
I mean, respectfully, I think she has a pretty sick, like, penthouse apartment.
Yeah.
I thought it was tough on grandmas.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, grandmas,
they can be tough. I was like, I see both
there's
sides
some weird
of this
grandma
one.
stuff.
Sure. Yeah. But I was more thinking about it's like a tough day for grandmas.
What are your thoughts
I guess
on
moms?
becoming a grandma?
Not anytime soon.
Okay.
So when do I start giving those speeches?
Chat with Knox about that. I think that, as I said at the beginning, this movie is a really important bridge for generations of movie fans to be more open to international stories. But I think it's also a huge bridge for animation at large being accepted beyond your typical Disney storytelling style. Now, there's obviously huge other studios that exist, DreamWorks, Illumination. They've released dozens of huge movies over the last 25 years. Those are usually movies for the masses, for really young children. But then in addition to that, you've got Aardman in England and the Wallace and Gromit films and Chicken Run and all of those stories. And then you've also got Laika and the stop motion animation style that they use. And this film, maybe more than any other, like signals the dawn of a new golden age, whatever, a platinum age. If you think like the 30s and the 40s with Disney, and then you get this fascinating kind of like mid-century all the way through the mid-80s. It's not a fallow period for Disney, but it's not as strong as you would want it to be. And in fact, most of the interesting animation work that's happening is usually like on the outer edge of culture, like Ralph Bakshi or folks like that. And then in the 90s and the late 80s, they were like, Disney really takes the crown back with like Little Mermaid and Aladdin and The Lion King. And then this is the one that kind of kicks down the door for anybody who isn't Disney to be mainstream in some ways. And I really like that about it. I think it makes it a really elegant inclusion in this list.
Yeah.
And Miyazaki, we got to appreciate him while we got him. So apparently he's making another movie.
Right. Well, it was one of those, he's retiring, and then reports of my retirement have, been greatly overestimated. This seems to be a pattern with him, right? Of just being like, I'll never do this again. And then here's another masterpiece.
Yeah. Same with me in podcasting. Every time I'm like, I'm done. I can't do anymore. And then next week, banger after this is Final Destination week. Got to step up. Got to make The Wind Rises. Recommend it if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So we've already mentioned a handful of these titles. I mentioned Alice in Wonderland. I feel like that's the most significant companion. Pinocchio, Up. I would recommend The Secret World of Arrietty if folks haven't seen it. It's a Studio Ghibli movie that I believe he wrote. I think he's the screenwriter on that film and has a somewhat similar tone. I also added Into the Spider-Verse.
You know
what I mean?
That's the first one, right?
That kind of the first one, yeah. That sort of like almost like the noisiness of the frame. The idea of so many things happening at once in the movie feels super informed by Miyazaki.
And colors and like the relationship of like the to classical art, for
Mhm,
lack of a,
mhm.
you know, of all, but Japanese as well as, you know, the Western canon. But that I do think it looks like something recognizable that you would see hanging on a wall in a museum.
100%. A lot of the images are taken directly from historical Japanese art from this film, and you can see the huge influence on that in all modern animation. I also mentioned Watership Down,
Mm-hmm.
which I think just the sort of like mournfulness of that story, like the
Right.
gravity of that story, which is so unusual in animation to convey that.
And also just like a whole other world of creatures who have like a life and rules of their own.
Exactly.
And how they live. I added Narnia
Mm-hmm.
and The Golden Compass.
Mhm.
And I'm not like, the books are probably closer than whatever film adaptations exist. Haven't seen Greta's yet, so I'm not going to pass judgment.
Recommended if you like Greta's Unmade Chronicles of Narnia trilogy.
But both places, you know, instances of a young person passing through like a doorway or a cabinet door or some physical structure into another spiritual world.
Great recommendations. Okay. Well, that's the only animated film
That's it
on the list.
Well,
yeah.
you got anything else that you want?
It feels
Ratatouille is like, I'm sorry, but I like it a lot.
it's a wonderful film about
That's great.
the act of creation.
Sure. So's this.
Sure. And yeah. I don't think they're redundant,
Okay.
but I'm sure there are some listeners who may be disappointed. We won't speak too much about Pixar.
Okay. I feel okay with that. I know they're very important, but this seems more important.
This is more in line with the auteurist nature of this project.
Mm-hmm. And our tastes.
Yeah. Miyazaki and Pixar are pretty neck and neck for me in terms of like what kind of a movie do I want to watch if I'm going to watch a movie.
But Toy Story is not eligible.
Toy Story is not eligible. And if it were,
then we would be having that conversation. But it's not.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think there is something to that there was like a wild act of creation in the making of Toy Story because there'd never been a movie like that before. That isn't true specifically of this Miyazaki movie, but it felt like the culmination. So that's our pick. I can't even remember what 18 is. What's 18? Don't say it. What is it?
It's a good one.
Is it?
Yeah.
Imagine if you were like, it sucks. One of the worst ones we've picked.
It's one where it's a director where there could have been several entries, I think.
Okay.
Prolific filmography.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, there was never a question.
I like that tease. I can't even remember what the film is.
Okay.
Stay tuned to The Big Picture if you want to find out. Thanks to our producer, Jack Sanders, for his work on this episode. Later this week, we'll be talking about Lilo and Stitch. Speaking of animation, come to life and a world of wonder. We'll see you then.